The bell above the door of the corner note gave a soft, tired jingle as a new customer stepped in, escaping the cool night air. Inside, the world was warm and fuzzy, wrapped in a blanket of low light and the gentle murmur of quiet conversations. The air smelled of old wood, spilt beer, and the faint, greasy, sweet scent of onion rings from the kitchen. It was a place for endings. The end of a workday, the end of a date, the end of a long week. People came here to unwind, to let the day's hard edges soften in the dim glow dot at the far end of the room. Tucked into its own small spotlight was the bar's centerpiece, a grand piano, its black lacquer gleaming like a pool of ink. Behind it sat the house pianist, a man whose flashy silk shirt seemed a little too bright for the subdued lighting. He played with the confidence of someone who knew every note by heart, his fingers moving with an easy, practiced swagger across the keys. His music was pleasant, a mix of old jazz standards and pop songs you could hum along to, but it was safe. It was background music, the kind you could talk over without ever missing a beat. He played for the scattered applause and the occasional nod of appreciation, a small, satisfied smile always playing on his lips as he took a small, theatrical bow after each song. Moving through the tables with a quiet, almost invisible grace was a young woman. She was the waitress, and to the handful of patrons in the bar, she was simply part of the scenery. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat but functional ponytail, and her uniform, a simple black apron over a white shirt, had seen its share of long shifts. A slight, permanent weariness seemed to sit in the curve of her shoulders, but her smile for the customers was always polite, always genuine. She was a ghost gliding through the room, refilling coffee, clearing empty plates. Her presence noted only when a glass needed refilling, but if anyone had looked closely, they might have seen the small tells. They might have noticed that as she stood by the kitchen waiting for an order, the fingers of her free hand weren't still. They would dance an invisible, silent pattern on her thigh, a complex rhythm of taps and presses that had nothing to do with impatience. Or they might have heard the soft, almost subconscious hum that escaped her lips as she wiped down a table, a melody not from the radio, but one that seemed to bloom from inside her. Rich with harmonies the man at the piano never attempted, she had a way of listening to him, too. Her head would tilt just slightly, her eyes losing their focus for a second, as if she were looking at the music itself, seeing the shapes of the chords he played. She could hear the tiny hesitation when he transitioned from a G to a C minor, the slight laziness in his left hand that no one else in the room would ever notice. She didn't judge him for it. It was just an observation, like noticing the color of a passing car. Music was her other language, the one she spoke when no one was listening. Tonight was a slow night, a Wednesday. The crowd was thin. An old man sat at the bar, nursing the same glass of whiskey for the past hour. A couple in a corner booth spoke in hushed, excited tones, lost in their own little world. The pianist was growing restless. His usual tricks weren't getting the reaction he craved. A flashy run down the keys earned only a half-hearted glance from the bartender. A playful wink at the old man was met with a blank stare. He felt the small energy of the room like a lead weight in his stomach. He needed a spark, something to wake everyone up. To remind them that he was the show, he finished his song, a rather upbeat version of Fly Me to the Moon, with a flourish and a dramatic pause. Waiting for the applause he knew would be light. It came, just as he expected, a few claps, no more. He leaned back on his bench, his smile feeling tight on his face. His eyes scanned the room, looking for something, anything to latch onto. They passed over the couple, over the old man, and then they landed on the young waitress. She was at a table near the stage, quietly stacking the last of the dirty glasses onto her tray. She was in her own world, her expression soft as she hummed that silent, internal tune of hers. To the pianist, she looked like the perfect target. Unassuming, quiet, a blank canvas. An idea began to form, a spark of mischief that quickly grew into a bright, burning flame. It was a risk, but he was bored. And a bored showman is a dangerous thing. He leaned toward the microphone, its crackle making the few people in the room look up. His voice, smooth and a little too loud, sliced through the quiet hum of the bar. "All right, folks," he began, a grin spreading across his face. "How about we shake things up a little?" All eyes turned to him. He gestured with a sweep of his hand toward the young woman, who froze with her tray half raised. "My lovely assistant here has been working so hard all night. Let's give her a round of applause." A few people clapped politely, confused. The young woman looked up, her eyes wide with surprise and a hint of alarm. "I bet," he continued, his voice dripping with playful challenge, "that for $20 she couldn't even sit down here and play a simple song. What do you say, darling? You got any talent hidden up that sleeve?" The room held its breath. A few uncomfortable chuckles came from the booths. It was a cruel joke, or at least a thoughtless one. Everyone expected her to blush, to stammer an excuse, and to hurry away to the safety of the kitchen. The pianist watched her, his grin wide, enjoying the little drama he had created. But the young woman didn't blush. She didn't run. She simply stood there, her tray held steady, and for the first time that night, the tiredness in her eyes was replaced by something else. It was a flicker of quiet, intense resolve. She placed the tray carefully on an empty table, her movements slow and deliberate. Then she walked toward the piano. A path seemed to open in the air before her. The whole bar was silent, watching, wondering. She stopped in front of the pianist, who was now looking at her with a raised eyebrow, and said, in a voice that was surprisingly clear and steady, "Okay, I'll play." The pianist's voice, slick and loud, hung in the air like a bad smell. For a moment, the whole bar seemed to stop breathing. The clink of a fork against a plate ceased. A laugh from the booth died in a man's throat. All eyes, including the young woman's, were fixed on the man at the piano, whose triumphant grin didn't quite reach his eyes. He was enjoying this, the little king of his small, dim kingdom, and he had just picked the most unassuming subject for his courtly joke. A soft, uncomfortable wave of murmurs rippled through the room. People looked at each other, their expressions a mix of pity and embarrassment. It was a clumsy, public act of meanness, and everyone felt it. The young woman stood frozen, her hand still holding the empty glass she was about to place on her tray. A hot flush crept up her neck, burning her cheeks. She could feel every single eye on her, a weight far heavier than the tray of dirty dishes she often carried. Her first instinct was the one everyone expected. She wanted to run. She wanted to retreat into the steamy, noisy safety of the kitchen and let the door swing shut behind her, cutting off the stares and the smirking face of the pianist. She was just a waitress. That was her role here? It was the role that paid her rent and bought her ramen noodles. It was the role that kept her dreams of concert halls filled with silent, attentive listeners at bay, tucked away in a dusty corner of her small, third-floor apartment. But then something else stirred inside her. It was a quiet, stubborn feeling that had been growing for a long time. It was the frustration of being seen as only what she did, not what she was. It was the exhaustion of being invisible, of being a part of the furniture. All those late nights hunched over a keyboard in a practice room at the conservatory, her fingers aching, her mind burning with complex musical theory, all of it flashed through her mind in a heartbeat. She thought of the torn-up sheet music she kept in a folder by her bed, the scores she studied until the notes swam in front of her eyes. This man, with his flashy tricks and his predictable songs, had no idea. He saw a tired girl in a stained apron and saw an easy target. The thought that he might feel even a sliver of satisfaction from her retreat was more unbearable than the public embarrassment. A small, hard knot of determination tightened in her stomach. It wasn't about the $20. It wasn't even about proving him wrong, not really. It was about proving to herself that she wasn't just the person who cleared their tables. She was a musician. And sometimes musicians have to play with a slowness that felt both deliberate and surreal. She lowered the glass back onto the table. She placed her tray, laden with empty plates and glasses, onto an empty chair beside her. The movement was so quiet, yet it seemed to echo in the profound silence of the bar. The pianist watched her, his grin starting to look a little less certain. He had expected a flustered no, a quick escape. He hadn't expected this unnerving calm. The old man at the bar leaned forward, his whiskey forgotten. The couple in the booth, who had been lost in their own world, were now completely focused on her. She began to walk towards the piano. The short distance from her table to the small stage felt like the longest walk of her life. The worn wooden floorboards creaked softly under her worn-out sneakers. Each step was a conscious choice. She passed the table with the couple. The woman gave her a small, encouraging smile that felt like a secret handshake. She passed the old man. He simply watched, his expression unreadable but intense. The air around the piano seemed different, thick with the energy of the challenge and the silent judgment of the room. The spotlight, which had been aimed at the piano keys, now caught her in its glow, bathing her in a soft, warm light that made her dark hair shine. The pianist didn't move from the bench. He just sat there, his arms crossed over his chest, his pose saying, "Go on then." "I'm waiting." When she reached the piano, she didn't look at him. Her eyes were fixed on the keys, the familiar 88 black and white friends who had never let her down. The polished wood was cool and smooth to the touch as she rested her fingers on the edge. For a moment she just stood there, absorbing the silence. She could hear the low hum of the ice machine behind the bar, a distant sizzle from the kitchen, the quiet breathing of a room full of people holding its breath. The pianist, finally, reluctantly shifted his body to make room, swinging a leg over the bench to stand up. He shot her a look that was part annoyance, part curiosity. "All yours," he said, his voice lacking its earlier boom. She didn't respond. She simply sat down where he had been moments before. The velvet of the bench was worn and familiar. She ran her hands over the keys, not playing them, just feeling their surface, their edges. It was like greeting an old friend. She adjusted the bench, moving it a fraction of an inch forward, a tiny, personal ritual that she had done 1,000 times before. In that small act, something changed. The waitress's uniform, the tiredness in her bones, the hungry ache in her stomach, it all seemed to fall away. She was no longer in a dim bar on a Wednesday night. She was at her instrument. The room, the pianist, the audience, it all faded into the background. There was only her and the piano and the music waiting to be let out. The moment she sat down, a transformation took place that was almost physical to witness. The young woman who had walked across the floor with the quiet, weary posture of someone ending a long day was gone. In her place sat a musician. Her shoulders, once slumped with the invisible weight of her apron and her worries, straightened. The tired line around her mouth smoothed out, replaced by a look of intense focus. Her hands, which had been holding a tray of sticky glasses moments before, now hovered over the keys with the light, poised grace of a bird about to take flight. She didn't glance at the stunned pianist standing beside her or at the silent, watching crowd. Her world had shrunk to the ivory and ebony landscape in front of her. The pianist, still standing off to the side, felt a knot of unease tighten in his gut. This wasn't what he had expected. He had expected fumbling, a clumsy attempt at chopsticks or heart and soul, something that would get a few pity laughs and then a return to the status quo. He hadn't expected this stillness, this aura of absolute command. He saw the way her fingers settled, her thumb perfectly aligned with middle C, the slight curve of her wrist that spoke of years of disciplined practice. He suddenly felt very small and very foolish, a street magician who had just challenged a master illusionist for a few heartbeats. The only sound in the bar was the low hum of the refrigerator behind the bar and the faint sound of traffic from the street outside. Then she played the first note. It wasn't loud or showy. It was a single, clear, perfectly pitched E-flat that hung in the air like a single drop of rain in a silent forest. It was pure and clean, and it seemed to absorb all the other noise in the room. Conversations that had been waiting to resume died on people's lips. The bartender, holding a glass in midair, froze. What followed was not a song, but a story. A story told in notes. She had chosen a piece of music that was the complete opposite of the loud, flashy tune the pianist had just finished. It was a nocturne, a piece meant for the night, filled with longing, beauty, and a deep, quiet sadness. It was the kind of music that didn't ask you to clap along. It demanded you to listen. Her left hand began a gentle, rolling rhythm, a steady and comforting pulse like a soft heartbeat. It was the sound of waves lapping at a shore in the moonlight. Then her right hand began to weave a melody. It was a melody so full of feeling it was almost tangible. It soared and dipped, it whispered and cried. It spoke of love and loss, of memories that were both beautiful and painful to recall. Her fingers, which had been clearing tables and wiping down counters just an hour ago, were now dancing across the keys with an impossible blend of strength and delicacy. They moved with a speed that was breathtaking, but it wasn't frantic speed. It was controlled, precise, every single note chosen with a purpose. The music swelled, building to a climax of breathtaking complexity and emotion. It was a storm of sound, powerful and overwhelming, and the small bar felt like a grand concert hall. A man who had been arguing with his friend about football leaned back in his chair, his mouth slightly open, his argument completely forgotten. The couple in the corner booth held hands across the table, their eyes locked on the woman at the piano, their own small world momentarily eclipsed by this larger, more beautiful one. The old man at the bar slowly raised his whiskey glass, not to drink, but as if in a silent, private toast. The most telling reaction, perhaps, came from the pianist himself. He stood with his arms crossed, but the smug look was long gone. In its place was a look of pure, unadulterated astonishment. He was a professional. He knew music. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was listening to someone who possessed a talent he could only dream of. He saw things in her playing that he couldn't do, a subtle caress of a key, a perfect rubato that made the tempo breathe, a control over the dynamics that was masterful. He had challenged a servant and found a queen. As the piece moved towards its end, the storm of sound began to subside. The melody softened, the rhythm in her left hand became more gentle, and the music began to fade away like a dream dissolving upon waking. She played the final few notes, each one softer than the last, until the very last sound was a ghost of a note that seemed to hang in the air for a moment before vanishing completely. Her fingers rested on the keys, and the silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, sacred silence, the kind that comes after something truly profound has been experienced. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if everyone was afraid that making a sound would shatter the magic that had just filled the room. The air itself seemed to be vibrating with the memory of the music. Then, from the back of the room, a single person began to clap. It wasn't a loud clap, but it was firm and steady. It was the sound of genuine, heartfelt appreciation. It was quickly joined by another, and then another, until the whole room erupted in a wave of thunderous, heartfelt applause. It was a sound the bar had never heard before, so loud and so full of genuine awe that it seemed to shake the very dust from the rafters. For the first time all night, the applause wasn't for a showman. It was for an artist. The applause wasn't just a sound. It was a physical force. It was a wave of warmth that washed over the young woman. It was a second. It was a wave of warmth that washed over the young woman just as her fingers moved with a showman's confidence just a few minutes ago, felt clumsy and heavy. He stood at the edge of the stage, his posture changed from the loose, showman slouched to one of stiff, uncertain discomfort. The applause that had once been his drug was now a roaring tide of applause at his own humiliation. It was a weight that was pressing down on him, a sound that he couldn't small. It was a sound that made her breath. He looked at her back, her posture straight and still. She seemed to be in a world of her own, perhaps still listening to the echo of the notes she had just played, perhaps feeling the weight of the moment. The audience was hers, and the moment belonged to the audience and to the bar. The bar that was his stage was no longer his. The pianist stood there, his face a mask of disbelief and chagrin. He had been the star of this small show, the center of attention. He had chosen her because he thought she was the weakest person in the room, someone he could use to get a cheap laugh and feel powerful for a few minutes. Instead, she had taken his stage, his audience, and his spotlight and turned them into something beautiful and profound, something he could never have created. She hadn't tried to steal his thunder. She had simply made a thunder of her own. Then the pianist did something that no one expected. He walked slowly, cautiously, toward the piano. His steps were hesitant, not the confident stride of a performer returning to his stage. He looked like a man approaching a wild animal, not sure if it would flee or turn on him. The crowd watched him, their applause dying down to a few last, stray claps, then to a deep, attentive silence. He stopped beside the bench. He didn't look at the young woman. He couldn't bring himself to meet her eyes. Instead, he looked at the keys that had just told a story so much more compelling than any he had ever told with his own hands. His voice, when it came out, was a quiet rasp, stripped of its usual booming confidence. "Can you play the blues?" he asked. The question hung in the air, a complete reversal of everything that had happened just minutes before. It wasn't a challenge. It was a plea. It was a request from a man who had just been shown the limits of his own talent, asking to be taught by someone he had just publicly shamed. A small, knowing smile touched the young woman's lips. It was the first real smile she had shown all night, and it lit up her face in a way the dim bar lights never could. She understood what he was asking. He wasn't just asking for a song. He was asking to be included in the moment had just shared. He was asking to be part of something beautiful. She didn't look at him, but she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Without missing a beat, her hands moved to the keys. The sound that came out was completely different from the classical piece that had just captivated the room. This was raw and gritty, full of a swagger and a soulful ache that was the heart of the blues. It wasn't perfect or polished. It was messy and human, full of bent notes and a rhythm that felt like it was breathing on its own. It was the sound of late nights and lonely highways, of heartache and hope, all rolled into one. She played with a freedom that was infectious, her body starting to sway with the music, a picture of pure, unadulterated joy. This was the final straw for the crowd. If the classical piece had been a revelation, this was a conversion. The bar erupted again, but this time it was different. The applause was accompanied by whoops and hollers, by people stomping their feet and clapping their hands on the tables. The old man at the bar was tapping his glass on the counter, keeping a steady beat. The couple in the corner booth was now on their feet, dancing in the small space between their table and the wall. The pianist, watching from the side, felt a grin spread across his face, a genuine grin this time. He was no longer the center of attention, and he had never felt more alive. He was just another member of the audience, completely swept away by the magic of the woman at the piano. The woman who had been just a waitress. The woman who had left them all, including him, in absolute, breathtaking awe. The last blues note hung in the air, a raw, honest sound that seemed to sigh before it faded into the warm, wood-paneled walls of the bar. For a second there was that same sacred silence, but this time it was different. The silence that followed the classical piece was one of reverence, a shared holding of breath after witnessing something delicate and beautiful. The silence now was thick with energy, an electric hum that vibrated with the memory of the music and the wild, joyful spirit it had unleashed. It lasted only a moment before the room exploded. The sound was a living thing. It was a roar of pure, unfiltered joy. People were on their feet, not just clapping, but shouting, whistling, stomping their feet on the worn wooden floor. The old man at the bar was actually banging his empty glass on the counter with a grin that split his wrinkled face. The couple in the corner were laughing, lost in their own private celebration of the moment. The applause wasn't just for the performance anymore. It was for the story, for the unexpected, for the sheer, unbelievable magic of what they had all just witnessed together. Finally, the young woman at the piano stood up. The spotlight that had felt so intimidating just an hour ago now felt like a warm embrace. She turned to face the room, and for the first time, she seemed to see them all not as a collection of customers, but as a room full of souls who had shared a journey with her. A shy, almost surprised smile played on her lips. She gave a small, graceful nod, a gesture of gratitude that was more genuine than any bow she could have ever performed. Then she took a step back from the piano, her shift as a musician over, her role as a waitress waiting to resume. As she turned to walk away, the pianist stepped forward, blocking her path. His face was a study in contrasts. The showman's mask was gone, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. In his eyes she could see a flicker of shame, but it was overshadowed by a deep, newfound respect. He was looking at her not as a waitress, not as a challenge, but as a peer, as an artist who had just shown him something he had never known. "I had no idea," he said, his voice quiet and rough, stripped of all its usual performance polish. I've never heard anything like that. You're incredible." He reached into his back pocket and pulled out his worn leather wallet, fumbling for a crisp $20 bill. He held it out to her, his hand trembling slightly. "A bet's a bet," he said. A weak attempt at his old swagger that fell completely flat. She looked at the money, then back at his face. She saw the genuine humility in his eyes, and in that moment, the last of the heat she had felt from his public challenge melted away. This wasn't about winning or losing anymore. It was about music, and it was about respect. She reached out and gently pushed his hand back toward him, closing his fingers around the bill. Her touch was light but firm. "The lesson was free," she said softly. Her voice held no anger, no sarcasm, only a quiet, simple truth. It was the kindest, most powerful thing she could have said. The pianist just stared at her, speechless. He slowly put the money back in his wallet as if it were a sacred relic. He had come to the bar that night feeling like a king, and he was leaving it feeling like a student. Just then, a man in a clean shirt and a slightly less tired face came out from the back office. It was the bar's manager. He was a man who was usually more concerned with inventory and payroll than with the house music, but he had heard everything. He had stood in the doorway of his office, his mouth hanging open, as the ordinary world of his bar had been turned upside down and remade into something extraordinary. He walked straight past the pianist, ignoring him completely, and stopped in front of the young woman. "I'm sorry, what's your name?" he asked, his voice filled with an urgency and a respect he had never used with her before. She told him her name. He listened as if it were a word of great importance. "I have never seen anything like that," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "Never, my customers ... He looked around at the buzzing, happy room. "They're still talking about it. They're buzzing." He took a breath, making a decision right there on the spot. "I don't know what you're studying at that fancy school, but you have a gift. A real one. From now on, every Wednesday night, this piano is yours. No waitressing. You play. We'll pay you what we pay him, double it for the first night to get you started. And you play whatever you want." The young woman just stood there, stunned. Her mind raced. This was everything she had been working for, a chance to play, to be heard, to be a musician. But then she looked over at the pianist, who was standing awkwardly to the side, watching his world get handed over to the girl he had tried to embarrass. She saw not a rival, but a fellow musician, a man who had simply been comfortable in his own small pond until a whale had swum into it. She looked back at the manager, her decision made. "That's very kind," she said, her voice steady and clear. "But I can't let you do that to him." The manager looked confused. "To who? To him?" She gestured with her head toward the pianist. "He's the one who has a steady job here. I'm just a student trying to get by." Then she turned to the pianist. What if we played together?" she suggested. "One night, me. The next night, him. Or we could play duets. We could make the music better." The pianist looked at her, truly floored. He had tried to knock her down, and she was offering him a hand up. He had expected her to take his job, his stage, his pride. Instead, she was offering to share it. He felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the cheap whiskey he sold. He saw that this wasn't just about talent. This was about character. And her character was as beautiful as her music. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face. "I'd like that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'd like that a lot." The manager, seeing the whole picture now, broke into a wide grin. "Done," he said, clapping his hands together. "It's a new show at the corner note." And just like that, the challenge was over. It hadn't been a contest after all. It had been a collaboration waiting to happen. The young woman walked back to the kitchen to finish her shift, but the bar was different now. The pianist went back to his bench, but he didn't play a flashy tune. He just sat there, quietly, thinking about the music, and about the quiet waitress who had taught him a lesson in humility he would never forget. The bar was filled with a new kind of energy, a promise of the beautiful music that was still to come, born from a single unexpected public challenge.